So hello again, welcome. My name is Rachel Edgell. I'm one of the college coaches at ESM Prep's London office. I wanted to give a presentation. I'm calling this a British Students Guide to US Universities, but a lot of what I say could very well apply to international students in general. So if you're an international student or if you have an international student in your family and you're joining us, please don't be deterred by that title. But a lot of what I will talk about today will be UK focused because that's where I am right now. And that's what I know probably the best outside of the US. Just for some sort of housekeeping notes, if you do have questions at any point, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and I'd be happy to answer those. I will probably save them for the end because it's just me on this webinar, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to manage questions if we wait until the end. So we're going to talk about a lot of things in today's presentation, but I want to first sort of give some context on why I'm talking about this. If you can't tell by my accent, I am American, and I went to an American university before I moved to the UK. And so I'm very much coming from an American perspective. And when I got to the UK, I realized that there were so many differences in our university culture in particular, that saying about us being two countries separated by a common language, it really was true for me. And so working with different students from the UK, I think learned a lot of things about what can make this a little bit easier for students coming from a UK perspective. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So we will talk about a little bit of the Americanisms, the US university lingo that can be confusing. We'll talk about the actual experience of attending university in the US and how that's different to the UK or other countries. And then we can sort of use all of that to lead into some advice on the actual applications, which again are going to be a bit different to the UK or other countries. So in terms of who should be watching this webinar, who I hope this will help, I think we should talk about what kind of student would be a good fit for American universities, because not every student is necessarily a good fit for the US. I have some bullet points on here. This is not an exhaustive list. I will talk about a lot of this in more detail throughout the presentation as well, but just to give you some food for thought for now, the kind of student that I think tends to do really well in the American system is the student that has varied academic interests. So if you know that you want to study physics and you don't have anything else that you find interesting in terms of intellectual or academic interest, then I would say the US is probably not the best fit for you. It's possible that you could find a university that allows you to study only physics, and we'll talk about what kind of university that is and how to find that. But typically the students that come to the US have varied academic interests. You might have a sort of a forerunner, a main interest, but it's not your only interest. It's not the sort of sole thing that takes space in your mind. Another attribute that I think is really helpful for students that come to the US is some sort of desire to belong in a community. So whether that's your school community, whether that's your neighborhood, whether that is a religious community or an ethnic community or whatever sort of community, however you want to define it, that also tends to be really helpful because the US has more of a pastoral approach at university, and they really want students to come and be engaged on their campus and not just focus on their studies. They want you to really be involved outside of the classroom as well. I think students who come to the US in terms of their personal qualities, they tend to be more adventurous and flexible because again, it really is a different culture, and that culture can vary pretty drastically depending on exactly where in the US the student finds themselves. So you do need to be a little bit flexible. There are going to be things that are different. There are going to be things that are confusing. But if you are adventurous and you like exposing yourself to new things, then that will probably be a good fit for you. If you have a potential interest in working in the US or in the international sort of sphere at some point, I think, again, this is a really good way to sort of test those waters and see what would it be like working in the US, what would it be like working for potentially an American company, that has an international presence or an international multinational company that might have sort of more American sort of work culture, things like that. That would be, again, another reason to consider the US. And then finally, I won't go into a lot of detail on this because it is very, very individualized consideration, but finances are a big thing to think about. I think before you make the application, because it would be a shame to go through the entire application process only to realize that a particular university is out of your sort of comfort zone in terms of finances. So again, this is a very individualistic thing. Families who are interested in having a student attend an American university should look at the individual sort of tuition and financial aid packages and so on for each university on their list. And it is something that is really not in my wheelhouse, but just a thing to consider. I think a lot of people maybe have misconceptions about the financial side of the American application because they see this really big number, and it is a big number, so there's no denying that. But I think a lot of people don't realize that oftentimes that number includes housing, which in the UK, for example, it may not. And I know things are changing in this post-Brexit world for students who want to study in the UK that don't have sort of home status. So we'll see how things play out in future, but definitely before you begin that application process, have a honest chat as a family about what you're comfortable with and what you're sort of looking for in that regard. So to get into the specifics then, there are a lot of, what I'm calling Americanisms, a lot of words that we use in the US and UK context, but that have very different definitions in either context. I don't have this on here, but I use university to refer to that sort of tertiary education system because I think it's a little bit easier and it clarifies what I mean. But a lot of Americans and a lot of other organizations might use university, college, or even school interchangeably. So just be aware of that. If you hear someone talking about college in an American context, they're talking about university. If you hear them say school, they could be talking about secondary education, or they could be talking about university/college as well. So something to be aware of. It's very confusing. Other sort of words that can be confusing are course. So in the UK context, students apply to a course, a program of study at a university. In the US, typically when we say course, we're referring to a specific class within a university setting. So example would be this Introduction to Political Theory. That's what I would call a course in the US context. On the other hand, the program of study, we would typically call a major in the US. Some universities might call this a concentration or something else, but it's the program of study, it's the subject in which a student concentrates during their undergraduate study. A lot of universities also offer minors, which are secondary subjects. They receive maybe a little bit less attention than the major, but they are still a focal point of the education in the American liberal arts system. And I'll go into more detail about what liberal arts means and what that might look like in a few minutes. And then finally, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. These are designations for the different year groups at university. Some of these are, maybe on the way out. I know that there's some pushback to the word freshman, for example, because it has the word man in it and doesn't sort of account for different genders. Other universities might say first year or second year or have a completely different verbiage altogether. But again, these are still pretty common, so I just wanted to clarify what those mean for students who might be listening or families who are looking into the American system. So the US, most universities that UK and international students apply to have a liberal arts approach. And again, this is very different to what we see in the UK and in a lot of other countries as well. But basically, the liberal arts approach, it has students for the first 2 years of their education taking a variety of different subjects. This can look like different things at different universities. So for example, I've got here the core curriculum. the distribution requirements, or the open curriculum. These are just different approaches to that liberal arts. So some universities like Columbia might have a core curriculum where every incoming student takes the exact same small set of courses or classes. Others might have distribution requirements or general education requirements where the university doesn't specify the exact course or the exact class that they want students to take, but they might say all students have to take, 1 or 2 science classes or 1 or 2 literature classes, and then the student can choose from a list of courses that meet that requirement. And then on the other sort of end of the spectrum from the core curriculum is the open curriculum, which universities like Brown University have, where students basically have free reign to take whatever courses they want. So that's that liberal arts approach. Students are typically not studying just one subject over the course of their 4 years, which is the length of a typical degree in the US versus 3 years like it is here in the UK. After those first 2 years of sort of exploration and trying different things, that's when students would choose their major and any minor or minors if they want. And then even though they will be focusing on that major and minor from that point on, they typically still have flexibility to take courses in other subjects. And I will actually show you an example of my transcript and just kind of walk through that to show what a liberal arts education might look like. There's no recipe, in terms of what students have to do, even within the same university or the same major. A student could take totally different classes from another student. And that's, I think, the beauty of the liberal arts approach, is that you really get to make it your own. So this is my actual transcript from when I was a freshman and sophomore at Princeton. So you can see my sort of first year, I was really just getting into those distribution requirements that Princeton had at the time. So I was taking a language course, I was taking a writing seminar, I was taking an astrophysics course, which fulfilled my quantitative requirement. I was taking the English literature course, which fulfilled a requirement. I think Introduction to Psychology also fulfilled a lab-based requirement. So I was trying to fit some of those requirements, as well as just explore different areas that interested me. I actually came into Princeton thinking that I would major in politics. And I changed my mind at some point, I think possibly second year. So you can see that I had started out taking a political theory course, but I ended up majoring in anthropology. And that Introduction to Anthropology course that I took my first semester, my first term at Princeton, I think was the reason that I ended up switching to anthropology. And I took that course because I happened to have an advisor. She was a faculty member who helped me choose my classes, make sure that I was fulfilling my requirements and so on. She happened to be in the anthropology department. And so she may or may not have been a little bit biased, but she recommended that I take Introduction to Anthropology, and I loved it. And the rest is history, as they say. But so you can see by second year, I was maybe still teetering on the edge of politics, but I had definitely really leaned into anthropology, and I was taking culture classes. I was taking another language. This time I took Hindi instead of Spanish, and starting to explore South Asia, which ended up being my area of focus within anthropology. And so then third year, this is when, as I said, students typically declare their major. And so at this point I had decided I'm definitely going to major in anthropology. So I started fulfilling the requirements of my major, which is what some of these ethnography classes are. And I continued taking various South Asian oriented courses. And then fourth year, my senior year, it maybe looks a little bit sparse compared to some of the earlier years, but Princeton had a thesis requirement. And so I was also writing my thesis at the same time as these 3 courses that I was taking. And you can see actually in my fourth, my final semester, I had started exploring education as an interest of mine. And I still had room to do that despite having chosen my major, despite having chosen my minor, which was the South Asian concentration. And despite fulfilling my general education requirements, I still had time to explore other areas. And I think, without having done that, I don't know if I would have necessarily gone into education as a career. So I'm really, really grateful that I had that liberal arts education to explore. And I think this final semester is what made me realize that I wanted to continue and do a 5th year of university and get my teaching qualification. So this is what my transcript looked like. And again, another student at Princeton and another student even within the anthropology department could have had completely different courses to me. And you have, freedom, whatever university you end up attending, you do have some freedom in terms of what you want to study and exactly how that ends up looking. So knowing all of this in terms of what the actual experience is like, we can talk about how that affects the admissions process, because I think the main differences in the admissions processes between the US and the UK are to an extent guided by the differences in the actual educational experiences. So in the UK, because students are applying to a program, the admissions process tends to be a lot more focused on that student's academic qualifications and their sort of suitability for the program that they want to study. Whereas in the US, it is a holistic admissions process, and they really value the context of an application rather than having sort of entry requirements and things like that. So I mentioned in my earlier slide the type of student that tends to do well at US universities. And I think that is what universities are looking for in the application itself. A lot of universities have their own campus culture, and they will look in the application through the various essays, the various activities that a student has done. They will look for some sort of evidence that that student will fit that culture, that student will contribute to the campus in a way that they're looking for. Some universities have their own institutional priorities. They have an idea of the kind of class that they want to create. And so they will evaluate your application and look for certain things, and what they look for could change to an extent every year. But those sort of general qualities of being a good community member and being academically engaged and having sort of varied interests and being flexible and so on, I think that stays consistent. So this holistic admissions that I mentioned, that's this idea of looking at the entire person. So they're not just looking at your academic record. They're not just looking at your suitability for whatever major you might have listed. They're looking at everything in terms of your sort of writing ability in your essays. They're looking at the content of your essays. What is going on in your mind. They're looking at the activities that you've done throughout school, throughout the last sort of 3 years before you apply. How have you divided up your time? What's important to you? How do you contribute to a community? Are you a leader in some ways? Are you a team member in other ways? What does that look like for you specifically? They are interested in your future goals and what kind of person do you want to be and what kind of career might you want. And they take all of this and look at it together, and that's how they decide whether or not a student fits what they're looking for. And they do all of this using context. So admissions officers will look at the school that a student is applying from, and they will look at, okay, what were the opportunities at this particular school, and how did this student take advantage of those opportunities? So I get a lot of questions from UK and from international students in general about, if other students are doing X or other students are doing Y. At the end of the day, I think the most important question that admissions officers are asking is, how did this student take advantage of the opportunities that they had? And those opportunities are going to be different at different schools or in different neighborhoods, or even for different students, depending on, if you are an athlete or if you have family commitments outside of school or whatever your sort of life looks like. So it really is a contextual and holistic admissions process. Another question that I get asked a lot is, if you might be like me and change your mind and switch your major after you've been admitted, why do universities even ask for your intended major in the first place? And there's a couple, main reasons for this. There may be others as well. I think the main reason is that, number one, they want to see whether or not you are aware, you're self-aware. So if you say that you want to study biology, and you want to be a biologist and so on, but then if we look at your actual academic record and you don't have any biology courses, then that is a question that admissions officers would definitely want to answer in the rest of your application. Is, why does this student want to study biology when they haven't taken any biology classes, they haven't done anything with biology yet? Another reason they might ask is, it does reveal sort of generally what kind of student you might be, even if you do end up changing your mind. So as an example, my switch from politics to anthropology is not sort of a drastic, earth-shattering difference in terms of the academic skills that I ended up using and the types of courses that I ended up taking. It's not that if I had switched from politics to mechanical engineering, that would be a much bigger switch. And at some universities, even that is possible, but it's less likely to happen. And I think asking for an intended major gives universities a general idea of where a student might fit within their university, even if they change their mind, which many students do. So that's completely fine to do. The actual admissions elements are also different, I think, between UK and US and many other countries. So I wanted to talk about a couple of pieces that I think are the most confusing for students, or tend to be like most different. So the personal statement is a great example of a piece of the application that has the same name in both the UK and US, but then ends up being very, very different in practice. So in the UK, the personal statement tends to be more like a cover letter, students explaining this is the program that I want to study, and this is why I think I'm suitable, and these are the different things I've done. In the US, it is not that at all. It is typically a creative writing exercise. It's full of a lot of self-reflection on who is this student as an individual. So it's really not about what a student wants to study, but rather how have their sort of experiences shaped them thus far? Again, what is going through their mind? How does their brain work? And what does that say about them as a person? So it's a very different writing exercise. And I think it's a very important one to know, because if you were to use a UK personal statement for the US or vice versa, you're going to end up having a comparatively weak personal statement. And it just doesn't accomplish the goal of that specific educational system. Another big difference in the application process is the interview. So again, in the UK, this tends to be an indication that a student has been shortlisted. So interviews are, I think, a little bit more high pressure. They tend to be subject specific. Now, in the US, universities that offer interviews try to offer them to every single applicant. A lot of these interviews are given by alumni volunteers. So I used to do the interviews for Princeton. And I would volunteer every year, just a few hours to interview a handful of prospective students, a handful of applicants. So it isn't necessarily a sign that you've been shortlisted in the US. And I think for that reason, it tends to be much more low pressure. It is typically just a casual conversation with an alum or sometimes with an admissions officer, but they're really just, interested in asking, why are you applying to this university? What do you like studying in school? What kind of extracurricular activities do you do? And maybe some other questions along those lines. But it should be seen as an opportunity for you to also learn more about the university, to ask about the student experience, and ask about what it was like to go to that university, because the person that you're speaking with has either attended that university in the past or they've worked there and either way have sort of their finger on the pulse, so to speak. So it's much more casual. It is not a test of knowledge of any kind. I think when you get asked the why are you applying to this university question, of course you need to have a good answer to that, and I think that does come from doing your research in that university. But hopefully by this point you would have already done that because you have actually applied. And so in your essays, you've probably talked about this a little bit. So, but you're not going to be asked questions specific to your intended major. So if you want to, study politics, your interviewer might be happy to talk politics with you if they are also interested in politics, but they are not going to be sort of asking you specific questions that you need to know the answer to. So I think that's another big difference for interviews. And that's basically it. So there's the sort of language differences that I think are the biggest hurdle to get over. And then once you've got a grasp of those, I think you can sort of understand the US system a little bit better in terms of liberal arts approach and in terms of the holistic application process. If you do want more information, I know we've got sort of a jargon spreadsheet that I can send out that goes into even more detail about some of those differences. And I'm always happy to have a chat if anyone does want to talk one-on-one about whether or not the US is a good fit for them. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A now, and we can take a few minutes and answer any specific questions. Otherwise, my email is here on this slide as well, and you're welcome to email me at any point with questions, or if you want to set up a quick chat about US universities as well. So I'll just wait a moment to see if anyone has questions. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone has questions, so I will take that as a sign that I did a good job answering them preemptively. So thank you very much for joining me today. Do feel free to email me afterwards, and I look forward to speaking with you then. I hope everyone has a good evening, good day, wherever you are. Bye.